We have our guest speaker, Stephanie Miller, who is somewhat of an expert on getting credentialed. She began her career leading marketing teams for commercial and real estate firms around the United States in 2004. And she's been doing, I think she's estimated she's done at least nearly 100 chambers submissions. Some of you may have met her. She was at the LA Law AGM in Chicago in 2011. She used to head our Chicago member firm, Much Shellis marketing efforts before becoming a freelancer. And we welcome her today to share tips on how to effectively get ranked in submissions, credentialing organizations. So welcome, Stephanie. Thank you. What I would ask is that if you have questions, that you just put them in the chat, and then when she's through with her presentation, she can address them. We've left some time at the end. So welcome, Stephanie, and I'll let you take it from here, and I will momentarily put your slides up.
Great. Thank you, Meg, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening to all of you who are participating today. I'm glad you could make the time to join us. As Meg said, I'm getting a little feedback I'll try to ignore. As Meg said, I have done a fairly large number of various submissions over the years, and it's a process that I've learned a great deal about, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of what I've learned with you today. I have a lot to cover, so I will be speaking at a fairly fast pace because I want to make sure there's adequate time for questions at the end. And I will be making a lot of references to chambers, but as I'm sure many of you know, most of the guidelines that apply to chambers are actually applicable to the other directories as well. So it will be relevant, even if I'm speaking specifically about chambers. So let's move on to an overview of what I'll be covering today. First, I'll give you a quick overview of the various directories, how they are similar and how they differ. Second, I will spend most of my time talking about sort of the elements of a successful submission. So we'll talk about best practices and sort of what the various researchers expect and what most resonates with them. So essentially, the elements of a well-written submission. In part 3, I will reserve time for Q&A, and I've also included a few slides of supplemental information that I think you will find useful. I won't go over it in detail, but I think it will be, it contains tools that I think you will find helpful. So let's get started. Meg, if you can pull up the table. So I suspect that most of you on the call are probably familiar with at least 2 of these tables. Chambers actually has the greatest dominance in terms of a legal directory. Legal 500 is more well known outside of the, I say of North America. ILFR focuses on financial and corporate work, and PitchBook, I suspect, is something that not many of you may be familiar with, but I think it's worth a look. So let's dive in a little bit. So in terms of practice area coverage, Legal 500 and Chambers are the most comprehensive in that they will contain attorneys and practice groups and law firms that are operating in a broad array of legal disciplines. The International Financial Law Review focuses primarily on financial and corporate work, and PitchBook focuses on private equity and venture capital. All of these have a pretty broad geographic coverage area. So they really focus on areas around the globe. Their research schedules are also similar in that they are staggered throughout the year based on jurisdiction and practice group. And we'll talk a little bit more about PitchBook, but PitchBook publishes data on a quarterly and an annual basis. In terms of the decision-making criteria, they are also fairly similar, particularly Chambers and Legal 500. They focus on, and this is really in the order of significance, client feedback, the submission itself, and market feedback, meaning feedback they get from non-clients about your firm. ILFR focuses primarily on transaction details, and PitchBook focuses exclusively on transaction details. In terms of what is new or unique about these ranking services, Chambers made a few new announcements this year. The most significant being that they now accept 30 referees or references. It was previously 20, so that's certainly a positive development. They've also added a number of new practice areas, and the best way to see if these new practice areas may be important to your firm would be to go to the Chamber site and search for your jurisdiction and the practice areas for that jurisdiction. And as I'm sure everyone knows, they also rank practice groups and attorneys in 6 bands, with band 1 being the most significant. ILFR accepts content that Chambers or Legal 500 content. So it's a fairly efficient way to submit information, in that you can repurpose content that you perhaps have already created. One other interesting thing about ILFR is they do regional rankings in Canada, China, and the United States. Those regional rankings tend to focus on smaller firms. So if you happen to be in any of those countries, it's an opportunity to get ranked perhaps with greater ease. And they also have Rising Star and Women Leaders categories that are also useful ways to get recognition for your female or younger attorneys. Legal 500 has no highlight or referee limits, so that's a plus. And I'd say the one disadvantage to Legal 500 is that they are less known in North America, but I know that they are working to increase their level of recognition and penetration within within that area. And PitchBook, as I mentioned, focuses exclusively on private equity and venture capital. It is really not that well known among law firms. So it is a great opportunity to get some exposure. And since they really target private equity and venture capital firms, it's a wonderful way to get in front of prospective clients. And Meg, if you could advance to the next slide. So this is just a screenshot that I took from the PitchBook database. It's quite robust. You can access it for free, although there is a modest fee in order to upload content into their database. You can sort and filter in a variety of ways. And this is actually an excerpt from their first quarter of 2022 results. And what you're seeing here are the number of transactions that these law firms handled during that time period. And you can see the numbers for the top firms are quite high, but the numbers towards the bottom are much more modest, meaning smaller firms do have the potential to be recognized. And there were actually other firms on the list. I just couldn't get them all in the shot. So I think it is definitely something worth taking a look at. I would suggest, if you do practice in this area, ask your clients if they're familiar with it. Just allowing yourself to do a little market research and determine if it is something you want to consider. So before we get started, I wanted to focus on a few questions that I suggest you ask yourself. Creating a submission is a time-consuming process, and knowing the tremendous value of your time, particularly if you don't have in-house staff, I think you should ask, is this really worth the effort? And I think there are a few things you can consider. First, would this validation benefit your business development efforts? Delving down deeper into that, are you pursuing large clients, or are your competitors, your primary competitors, ranked? If the answer to either or both of those questions are yes, then I think it's perhaps worthy of some effort. Do you have the desired qualities or characteristics, which we'll delve into throughout the balance of this presentation? And if the answer is yes, and you do want to pursue it, then I think it's a matter of considering which directory is the best complement to your firm. Meaning, if you can only do a limited amount, what should your focus be? On to the next slide. Throughout the presentation, I will include a couple of quotes taken directly from Chambers editors. The quotes will speak to probably some of the most critical aspects of a submission or a ranking. So here's the first. And let me say that a number of Chambers editors co-authored an article, and these quotes are taken from that article. So regarding firm size, Chambers editor said, "We do recognize that smaller firms may have fewer lawyers, but might be doing a higher quality of work and receiving more effusive feedback, which will merit a ranking. We try very hard to ensure that firms are not being penalized in the rankings because of the size of their firm." So let's move on. To begin the process, I think there are a few things you can do to set the foundation for the creation of a submission. First, if you have submitted in the past, you can reach out to your editor and ask for feedback. Generally, they will accept a brief phone call, or they will give you a summary of feedback in an email. They will tell you the number of referees that they spoke to, but they will not tell you who they are or what information they shared. Next, I think it is useful to review the relevant practice area definitions for your jurisdiction, just to make sure you are submitting in the ideal category. And keep in mind, you may have one matter that fits in more than one category. Perhaps you've done a real estate transaction and there were environmental concerns, or you did a corporate transaction that had intellectual property elements. It is appropriate and acceptable to include one matter in multiple submissions if you are submitting in more than one category. I also suggest that you take a look at the firms that are ranked in your jurisdiction. It's just kind of good competitive information just to see who among your neighboring firms are ranked. And then finally, I would plan for a 1 to 2 month completion process. This is quite generous, and the reason I say that is because if you are going to prepare a submission yourself while you are managing your busy practice, it's a lot on your plate. And I do think it's helpful to make sure you have adequate time, because a chamber submission is really not something that you can rush through. So next we'll talk about ranking criteria. So these are the overarching things that the researchers have stated that they look for: evidence-based details and data, capabilities at the elite end of the market, a caliber of clients relative to other firms, attorney depth and breadth, which is actually very critical for smaller firms. I mean, by nature, you are going to have smaller practice areas, but to show that you do a broad base of work, meaning, for example, if you have an IP practice, that it's not just all trademark work, but other types of intellectual property. Or if you have a real estate practice, you're doing a variety of types of real estate transactions, things of that nature. Also, a track record of sophisticated and complex work, market dominance or a dominant presence in your market, and firm vitality. And we'll get into all of these a little bit later. So essentially, they are looking for firms that are performing on equal footing with your larger counterparts. So now we'll delve into the specific categories or specific sections of the submissions and some things that you should keep in mind. It's been my experience that oftentimes most effort is put into the matter highlights, which is they're certainly deserving, and that the about the firm or attorney bio sections are kind of often thrown together. And I think these are areas where it makes sense to be strategic in the content that you provide, because it really does help sell your firm. So my advice is don't underestimate the importance of these sections. This is where you can summarize the work you've done collectively or individually over the past 12 months. And it doesn't have to be limited to what you're describing in the matter highlights. So I give you a few examples there of the types of things you might want to consider. And of course, that list could be much longer. Also, in terms of attorney bios, you want to focus on the partners and associates that you're singling out for consideration. That doesn't mean that you should only include those bios in the attorney bio section, but I recommend that you really put most of your effort into how you're describing those partners and associates. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the feedback section. Oftentimes, this section will be left blank because it is optional, but I think it's a great place to make your case if you believe your practice group or some of your attorneys should be ranked or ranked higher. You can also give feedback on other firms in your jurisdiction. These researchers and editors have to amass so much information in order to have a solid understanding of what's happening in your jurisdiction, that they really appreciate it if there's information that you have that you can share with them. Perhaps you are aware of a prominent attorney who has retired, or you're aware of a subset of a practice group that has spun off and started their own firm. Any knowledge you have of things going on in the market will be of value to the researcher. So anything that you know, I would encourage you to share. You can also make suggestions on new practice areas. I'll give you a very quick story. I worked at a firm in the Midwest. It was not much cellist. Another firm in the Midwest that had a really great intellectual property practice, and they were not ranked, and we really wondered why. So we reached out to an editor, and what we found out was there were no other firms in this market that were submitting to chambers, and they really could not do a fair evaluation of a single firm. So what they recommended to us and what we did was we reached out to our competing firms and said, we're missing an opportunity here. We could be ranked potentially in chambers, but we all have to put forth the effort. And it actually did work for us. And eventually that practice group was ranked. And we never would have thought that that was the answer to the challenge that we were facing. And then finally, relative to feedback, is you want to be honest with the feedback that you provide, but you want to be diplomatic as well. So now we'll get into how to go about choosing the best matters. The ideal matters meet some, if not all, of the following criteria. They are elite matters that belie the firm size, meaning these are the types of matters that would have been happily accepted by a much larger firm, but your firm had the capability to handle these matters. And that is something definitely worth promoting. That you are representing sophisticated and larger clients who hire you for complex high-end matters. You want to be strategic about the emphasis on already ranked firm stars. And what I mean by that is when you are choosing your matters, oftentimes those attorneys who are already ranked might have the largest number of matters to submit. And those who are pursuing a ranking have a relatively lower number of matter highlights. My recommendation is to shift a larger number of matter highlights to those who are aspiring to be ranked. It is very easy, it is challenging to get ranked. It is easier to stay ranked. So for those highly qualified attorneys who are ranked, they may want to sacrifice a few of their matter highlights to allow other attorneys to submit more information. So that's something to keep in mind. Avoid commodity work, meaning you really do want to focus on the sophisticated, complex, high-end matters. And keep in mind that you can include a matter in more than one submission. Now, next, writing matter descriptions. A few important points. Chambers editors will review hundreds of submissions over the course of a year, which means that they will literally be reading thousands of matter highlights. So a matter highlight that is well written, that captures their attention quickly, that summarizes the key facts is of critical importance. So the best advice I can give you is to be brief, be clear, and be specific. And also to consider the writing style. It is a very different type of writing from what you are accustomed to and trained to do in terms of preparing legal text. This is a narrative. It should have a clear beginning that defines the problem or opportunity, a middle that explains in detail what took place and who did what, and an end where you summarize the results and why it matters. The best advice I can give on the style is to consider scholarly publications for writing style information. If any of you are familiar with the publication, the Harvard Business Review, that's one that I will often use as an example of things where the style is very businesslike and professional, but it really sort of is a more, if you will, colorful way of writing where it really is in a narrative style. If a matter has a large group of attorneys, list the core group only, simplifying the reader's opportunity to really zero in on the important role that the individual attorneys play in a given matter. And include associates with significant roles because they are your future stars. And the way Chambers manages this information, they maintain a database of the attorneys who participate in these matters. And as associates kind of move up the ladder or ascend to partnership, if they have been referenced in a number of past matters, it really helps their cause as they aspire to be ranked themselves. And I say avoid obscure legal jargon. Those terms that are second nature to you may not be as well known by the editors or researchers that are reading this content. Next, on best practices, I won't go through these questions, but I wanted to include questions that you can use as a barometer as you were writing these matter highlights. So just keep these questions in mind. It's just a handy reference tool. Now we'll move on to our second quote, which is about what I think is the single most important element of a well done submission, and that is the referees. A Chambers editor said, "It's a good idea to ensure that the referees include those who can speak to the team as a whole, as well as the individual attorneys within the practice. Including referees who have direct experience with more than one attorney within the team is a good way of maximizing the space available on the referee spreadsheet." Let's talk a little bit more about referees. They represent the highest risk and reward for your submission. I think the most common weakness or potential weakness is a low response rate among your submitted referees. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you also want to carefully consider who you include as a referee. These should be people that are more than satisfied with your work. They are delighted with your work. These are your most passionate supporters in terms of their satisfaction with the work that you do. And these are people who ideally also believe that you're not equal to other firms, you're better than other firms. And on a practical matter, they must have time for a phone call. If you have clients who are difficult to get on the phone, they're probably not your best choice. Also consider their personalities. Are they talkers? Are they conversational? Are you confident that they can speak to your many talents and strengths in a compelling way? I think I mentioned that they should be associated with your matter highlights, and also they must have hands-on involvement in the matters. You would think, common sense might tell you that you should include the owners of a business or the C-level executives. And perhaps that is true if those are also the people who have hands-on day-to-day interaction with you and your colleagues, because these really do need to be people that can speak to the experience of working with you on an ongoing basis. Finally, while clients are best, you can also supplement the referee list with co-counsel, opposing counsel, members of the judiciary, expert witnesses, accountants, or other professionals. So you can keep that in mind as you're building out that list of referees. And next, we'll briefly review the referee interview process. The research or the phone calls, the initial contacts, if you will, are generally made in the month following the submission deadline. Researchers will tell you that they will reach out to someone in your firm and let you know when those calls will begin. But frankly, it's been my experience that that doesn't often happen. So it's important for you to build a relationship with the researcher, and there is information on the Chambers database that will tell you who is responsible for your particular category. And see if they will let you know when they're starting to make those calls. The contact is by email, and because they don't want to be a nuisance, they will only attempt contact 1 or 2 times, maybe 3 at the absolute maximum. So it is also important that you let your referees know who to watch for in their inbox. The calls are generally 15 to 20 minutes in length, And I've included here a list of categories of the types of things they will cover. Moving on, there is a growing trend among these ranking services for a greater focus on diversity. Both Chambers and IFLR both specifically request the firms consider inclusiveness when preparing their submissions, and they consider both race and gender. So keep that in mind as you are considering which of your attorneys, your clients, your matters, or your referees you are going to put forth. And it's very important to note, this is encouraged, but it's not required. And I've worked with many small firms who say, just based on, our smaller profile, we are not the most diverse firm when it comes to race or gender. And you will not be penalized. So it's not a concern, but just a consideration if you are able to factor that into the material that you submit. Next, potential challenges. As I mentioned before, the most common scoring weakness is a low referee response rate. And, by the time you finish a submission, it can be so exhausting and so time consuming that you don't necessarily have the bandwidth to handle the management of your referees. If you have an on-site staff person, that might be something you want to turn over to them just so they can help manage the process and, remind your clients and let the clients know from what domain name they are likely to get this email, et cetera, et cetera. You can also make updates to your referee list. So if after you submitted a referee list, one of your contacts has left their organization, for example, you can let Chambers know that. And that's the kind of thing that an administrator on your team could perhaps manage on your behalf. Another challenge, as I've mentioned, the client size and prominence relative to ranked firms is something to consider when you are creating your submission. By nature, as a smaller firm, you may have smaller clients. Now, you may be doing very sophisticated work for those clients. So the client size and prominence and matter complexity are all things you should consider. It's not, while Chambers says you are not penalized by nature of your size, I think you should still make every effort to submit matters that put you on par with your larger competitors in your market. Is Chambers overlooking your market? I mentioned that earlier about the situation I had with one of my law firms. And finally, keep in mind that recognition will likely be a multi-year process. I have been told it is very rare, and this has been my experience, very rare that a firm is ranked after its first submission because they're really looking for a consistent level of performance over more than 1 year. So a little patience is definitely in order. Moving on to the all-important band level. One of the most common questions I've gotten from attorneys is, what can I do to move up in band level? And here is a useful quote from a Chambers editor. Chambers will usually look at how a firm's work, feedback, and bench strength overall compare with the other firms ranked in the section. A firm will usually move up if the evidence suggests that the firm's overall offering in that area is comparable to those ranked in the band above. So now I'll give you just a really quick overview of the supplemental material that I included. First, I went through each of the 4 directories that are contained in this presentation and just created a list of the most useful links that you can use as you embark in this process. So we've got 2 pages of links for your later review. And then also on the 3rd slide in the supplemental information, I'm including, and I won't go through this, but I'm including just a list of the things that you should do to prepare for a call if you are in fact invited to be a referee or to offer market feedback. It is worth taking some time to prepare for such a call because it can actually serve a useful purpose for your firm. So just some things to keep in mind. So that wraps up the substance of the material I wanted to cover. I've included contact information here if you have any questions for me relevant to your specific circumstances. I'd be happy to reach out. Having been at an ally member firm and been responsible for one ally meeting, I certainly appreciate the challenges and opportunities that your firms face, and anything I can do to help the cause of seeing more ally members ranked, I'm happy to assist. And with that in mind, one more slide before we go to questions, Meg. I did want to offer a couple of ways that I will offer some sort of hands-on assistance. If you have an old submission and you'd like me to take a look at it, you can send me up to 4 pages that sort of reflect, let's say, the quality of your submission, and I can give you feedback in terms of style or substance that might be useful as you embark on future submissions. If you have never done a submission, you can certainly contact me and we can schedule a call. I can answer questions that are relevant specifically to your circumstances and offer advice. And of course, any information that you provide will remain confidential. And obviously, if you're interested in any submission consulting work, you can reach out to me and we can talk about pricing.